Beckett, for example, famously both wrote in English and in French, and he translated his own works, but he didn't translate them exactly. What I'm learning is how to read a poem out loud. Our professor gave us some instructions on how to use time and space when reading a poem to basically bring across that which the poem asks of us, how to use silence, intonation, and how to play with the originality of one's voice. People like Victor Hugo and Gustave Flaubert actually based their opinion of Dante solely on this translation, which is really more of a reinterpretation than a translation. And she says that all alcoholics, in a way, are intellectuals that have just come to a point where they reach the conclusion that the world is unsupportable as it is. Hello everyone, hi! So today I'm here to make a video about everything that I'm currently learning as a literature student. And by currently, I mean this week. So in case you're new here or you're not caught up, my name is Maria. I started studying literature a little bit over a year ago at this point, at the age of 28. And I document my journey of what it's like to do that here on my channel. And I like to make videos where I talk about what it is that I have to read, the topics I'm learning about in my studies. But usually what I do is I make those videos after the fact. So at the end of a semester, of a month, of a year, I sit down and I ask myself, what are the big takeaways for me? What am I grateful to have learned? And those are great. I love those videos. However, I think the video that I'm doing today is actually a more accurate representation of what it's like to actually study literature. Because right now I'm in the middle of my semester. I have not yet understood everything. I have not yet extracted all the bits of knowledge that I want to take with me. I don't have that overview. I don't have that privilege of letting it rest for a bit and then looking back over it and extracting all the little nuggets of insights that I want to take with me. I haven't had that yet. I'm literally in the thick of it right now. So I thought in this video I would just, in a way, freeze time and take a slice out of my student life and talk about what it is that is going through my head that I have to work with this week. So that's the video. If you end up enjoying this, please consider supporting the channel financially. I always leave my Ko-fi account as the first link in the description box below. Thank you so much for everyone who has supported me this past month. It really means the world to me. And now let's get into the video. So what I'll do is I will go through what I'm learning course by course. I'm taking a total of 9 different courses, and I'll tell you about them as I get to them. But if you want more of an overview of what these courses are about, I've made an entire separate video about that. I can link it up here in the cards. It's not required viewing, I think, for this video though, so don't worry about it. I'll get right into the first one, the course that is called Les Savoirs Imaginaires, so imaginary knowledge. So this course, in broad strokes, is about the limits of knowledge and alternative forms of acquiring knowledge. So last week in our lesson, we have thought about the concept of the unknown and how incredibly difficult it is to, first of all, speak about, because by definition the unknown is unknown, but also how even when defining it, it's always defined through what it is not, which is a little bit of an unsatisfying way of defining something, right? Through just saying what it is not. It doesn't really tell us a whole lot about what it is. If you look at the different languages, you know, in English you have unknown, so it's that which is not known. It's the same in French, l'inconnu. It's the same in German, das Unbekannte. It's the same in Dutch, het onbekende. It's the same in Spanish, lo desconocido. Lo desconocido. I don't speak Spanish. Then we looked at what some writers say about the unknown. We have taken a look at Bernard Werber's book, L'Encyclopédie du savoir relatif et absolu. And we also looked at a quote by Paul Valery, where he says, I'll read it first in French and then I'll translate it. On se réfugie dans ce qu'on ignore, on s'y cache de ce qu'on sait. L'inconnu est l'espoir de l'espoir. So it means we're seeking refuge in that which we ignore. We're hiding there from that which we know. The unknown is the hope of hope. And that quote, I've had to read it a few times over and let it sink a little bit, but it speaks of the hope that there is more than we know. There is something that we do not know that is good. We cannot believe that that which we know is everything there is. Maybe that would be just a little bit too devastating. Other than that, in this course, I'm currently preparing a presentation on Victor Hugo, analyzing one of his poems. It's called Les Djinns. And what I'm learning is how to read a poem out loud. Our professor gave us some instructions on how to use time and space when reading a poem to basically bring across that which the poem asks of us, how to use silence, intonation, and how to play with the originality of one's voice. So that, of course, is extra challenging for me as I have to do all that in French. So I have been walking up and down my living room, practicing this poem out loud and how I'm gonna present it to the class. The next course is called Marginalité, Créativité, Criminalité. So marginality, creativity, and criminality. And the course speaks about how basically those three things often go together. And in our last lesson, we talked about addictions and how having an addiction usually pushes you to the margins of society, which is in a way ridiculous if you think about it for more than 2 seconds. And that's just me adding my own thoughts in here. But everyone's struggling with some kind of addiction, with some kind of outlet in their lives. And just because it looks different in you than it looks in other people doesn't mean that the same impulse isn't there. It makes me think of that David Foster Wallace interview where he talks about the fact that we always worship something, that an atheist, for example, is not religious. He just worships something else, right? Worshipping science is just as much of a religious impulse, or being addicted to video games or whatever. It's the same mechanism of wanting to find safety and refuge and relief in something other than just oneself and one's own thoughts. So anyways, we talked about addictions and Margaret Duras, and how she was the first one to really write about alcoholism in such a direct way, as an addiction, as a problem, if you want. And she says that all alcoholics, in a way, are intellectuals that have just come to a point where they reach the conclusion that the world is unsupportable as it is. If you're more interested in this idea, you should check out her book La vie matérielle. I'm guessing it's translated as The Material Life. So yeah, our last lesson has been mostly on addictions, talking about different writers, reading some extracts of Marguerite Duras. This is a really big topic. I'm purposefully not going into it in a lot of depth. It's personally very challenging for me, and I feel like I need a little bit more time to let it all sink, but that's what we're dealing with at the moment in this course. Moving on to a little bit of a lighter topic, in my third course that is called Paris in French Cinema, I learned this week about the methodology of analyzing films. So at a very basic level, you can analyze any movie or scene from a movie from the point of view of staging, framing, and editing, I think. Yeah, staging, framing, editing. So staging is when you ask yourself what is in front of the camera, right? Literally everything that is in view is staging. The location, the characters, the lights, the acting, who is part of the scene, why, all of that, it's huge, right? There's a lot to analyze there, but all of that falls under staging. Framing is the question of where you cut people, right? How much of a close-up shot you do. So the point of view, basically. And then editing can be broken up into two pieces, image editing and sound editing. So which scenes are right after each other, for example, and why. And when you go about analyzing a movie scene like that, you really realize that, I'm realizing that it's really all just blocks that are being built to one bigger picture. And if a movie is good, you don't notice them. And if you don't study cinema, you probably don't pay very much attention to that. But once you do pay attention to that, it's this thing where, for me, once you see it, you can't unsee it. I've really been paying much closer attention to the movies I've been watching. I've been to the cinema handful of times at this point here in Paris, and it's definitely elevating my appreciation for the art of filmmaking. We then analyzed the opening scene of La Rafle. It's a 2009 movie where in the opening scene, as I said, there are actual scenes of Hitler walking through Paris, looking at all these beautiful monuments that are usually associated with love, with the city of lights. But then there's no people on the streets. So basically everyone had to stay home when Hitler was driving through the street. So it's already a little bit of an eerie, tension to see Paris but see no people. And then also the music that is in the background is very romantic, French. It creates this feeling when you're watching it like something's off, something's not right. And it gave me an actual sensation of like a little bit of a knot in my stomach. And that's just good storytelling when someone is able to do that, right? To purposefully have the visual and the audio, for example, go in different directions to create this kind of effect. Moving on to my course, which is called L'Esprit des Machines, so the spirit of machines. The central question of this course is what it means to create something, how literature has spoken about this topic, and we're sort of thinking it through all the way to our nowadays situation with AI. This week we were diving deep into Frankenstein, and I've alluded to this in my other video, but I have already read Frankenstein and I'm just so delighted over and over again to realize that there's so much about this book that it's endlessly analyzable. There's so much more to discover every time you read through it. I'm really enjoying it. So in our last lesson, we focused on two different scenes. One, the scene where the monster Frankenstein is actually created. I think it's chapter 5. So we took a close look at the creation process, what was involved to bring this monster to life, and the creator's reaction and account of that event. And then as the second scene, we talked about the center of the book, the moment when the monster recounts his own story. We're listening to his words. And what's beautiful about that is that on the one hand, it's the emotional center of the novel, right? It's the most vulnerable pages, but it's also the physical center of the novel. So if you have an edition at home, you can check. It's a little bit hard for me to show you here. And we talked about the fact that as we're reading this book, we're always in the role of the listener. We're always being told a story, but constantly from someone else. And that makes it so that, first of all, it creates a very unstable narrative. You're not entirely sure who to believe. But it also makes it so that there's not really a moment of rest in the novel. So that was fascinating. We just filled hours talking about a few pages of this book. And we haven't nearly exhausted everything that is to say about it. Oh yeah, just the last point. We also talked about the fact that a lot of people consider Frankenstein to be the first science fiction novel, because it is the dream of science taken to its ultimate conclusion. But other people are really against that kind of term associated with Frankenstein. So yeah, that's kind of what we ended on. Moving on. The next course is called French Philosophy, Human Sciences and Society. And in this course, we talked about Simone de Beauvoir this week. First, we talked a little bit about sort of the people that surrounded her. We talked about Camus and Sartre and about existentialism versus determinism. I'm not gonna go into that here in depth. I'm gonna make a video about it eventually, about existentialism, because it was very illuminating the way that it was explained, and I'm so glad I finally understand what it is. But I feel like this video is already kind of getting out of control. So that was just a lead up to Simone de Beauvoir. And we talked about that very famous quote, probably the one that is that she is most well known for, and that is, "One is not born, but becomes a woman." So, on ne naît pas femme, on le devient. And we read the page or so that follows this statement and talked about the fact how she wanted to say that there is no such thing as a feminine essence, that femininity is something that is cultural, that is learned, and that the way that she wrote about that in the second was just extremely revolutionary. Oh my god, I think I'm not allowed to say here. I think maybe my video will get demonetized. She also wrote about the female body in such an unprohibited way that is even still kind of refreshing and new even today. So we talked about that book and the incredible influence it had, the historical document that it is, and the different waves of feminism. We, for example, looked at when women were allowed to vote in France, which was only 1945. It's kind of late. But yeah, it was a nice little overview over de Beauvoir's work, and we're gonna still continue with that next week. Next up, course number 6 is my French language course. And we're currently learning how to correctly place adjectives and the cases in which you have to place it before the noun or after the noun. Very exciting, I know. We also had a presentation on the laïcité, so the law in France that, for example, in schools you cannot show that you're part of any religion. You know, you're not allowed to wear a cross, for example, and how all that came to be about and what it means and how it shapes French society. So that was reasonably interesting. So we can swiftly move on to the next course, which is called Poétique du corps souffrant, so Poetics of the Suffering Body. And in this course, last week, we talked about two authors, Béatrice Douvre and Alice DVB. Oh my gosh. Have to look up the author's name because I cannot read my own handwriting anymore. Okay, Alice DVB. Okay, so we talked about two writers, Béatrice Douvre and Alice DVB. And Alice DVB is actually a French writer, and she just published a book that is called Tombée du ciel. And this is, by the way, I think the third time this month that an author is basically guest lecturing one of my courses. So I don't know, I just find that really awesome. Anyways, Alice DVB, she herself suffered from anorexia. So it kind of fits the theme of the course, where it's like, how do authors deal with the suffering body and how do they write about it in their work? Her book is about her teenage years that she spent in a psychiatric hospital. So because of her anorexia, she was there from the age of 14 to 18. That alone is really intense. And she just had a lot of not so pretty experiences there. She was force-fed and just overall treated in a way that is at best questionable at times, and at worst just plain abusive. And we read extracts of the book. She told us about what it is actually like to have anorexia, you know, what it's like to have a voice in your head that just keeps telling you to do more and more extreme things, but how in the hospital anorexics are often just treated as people who refuse to eat, like they have a choice or something. And you know how her treatment was basically more of a game. Like they just took everything away from her and they said, okay, if you gain 1 kilo, you can have your phone back. If you gain 2 kilos, you can go outside for 30 minutes or something like that. But if you lose those kilos again, then we're gonna take it all away from you again. You know, and how that is just not an effective way of treating a severe disorder like anorexia. So that was a very intense session. Like somehow I don't know, I found myself at the end of that uni day going outside and being like, wow, that, you know, that escalated quickly kind of moment. Like we've talked about suffering in such in a much more abstract way, I feel, and then to just have someone there and reading extracts that are so incredibly descriptive and confronting in a way, I really had to take care of myself at the end of that day, and just, I don't know, I was just really not feeling well. You know, power of literature and people talking about their stories, just, yeah. That was heavy, but extremely interesting because it was in equal parts about, you know, anorexia and what that means and what could be done better, but also about her way of dealing with it and becoming a published writer and what she had to go through to actually write all of that down, and how people now recognize her on the street and thank her for actually depicting those situations in an accurate way. And I don't know, just all the consequences of all that. It was really fascinating to hear, and also a very confronting session at the same time. Last two courses. So L'Italie en France is my course about Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy and his influence on French writers. In the last session, we took a close look at the translation history of Dante into French and the ambiguous feelings that Voltaire, for example, had about Dante's work. So Voltaire was very influenced by Dante. He really appreciated him also for his courage to stand up against the Pope and the Church, for example. But in the Age of Enlightenment, when Voltaire lived, it just wasn't very fashionable to read anything that has a religious connotation, so he was kind of torn. He actually ended up translating bits of the Divine Comedy, and we looked at that translation, which is very interesting because he just added a lot of things to explain the story, basically, to French-speaking people, whereas Dante's version is a lot more subtle and low-key. And then we talked about that iconic 1783 translation by Antoine de Riverol. So he translated the Divine Comedy into French, but he only translated the Inferno. So the book suddenly wasn't called the Divine Comedy, it was called L'Enfer, so Inferno. And it became so popular that a lot of people thought that that's the end of it, you know, that the Divine Comedy only consists of the Inferno, and that Purgatorio and Paradiso don't even exist. And that translator just took so much freedom in translating Dante that he actually wrote prose. So he translated Dante's poem into prose because he said, well, that's a lot easier for French people to understand. And he just wanted to have fidelity to the reader, not to the author. And it became such a wild success that people like Victor Hugo and Gustave Flaubert actually based their opinion of Dante solely on this translation, which is really more of a reinterpretation than a translation by nowadays standards, I would say. And on top of that, there are just things that he simply misunderstood and didn't translate correctly at all. So, you know, power of translation once again. Other than that, I'm also working on my own presentation for this course on Dante's ideas in Borges's writings. So, I mean, I should be working on it. I'm gonna work on it this weekend because my presentation is next week. And last night I have done some research already. I've collected my sources. I'm so excited actually to work that through. I mean, just listen to that. I have to show you something. I am reading this thesis, and this is from the abstract of that thesis. This thesis examines the presence of Dante Alighieri in the creative work of Jorge Luis Borges. Its aim, however, is not to produce an extensive study of references and allusions to Dante and Borges. Rather, it seeks to define the nature of the encounter in its deeper literary and psychological implications. In this respect, three central themes in Borges's reception of the Dantean poem are explored, namely poetic language, ethics, and love. I mean, it's so exciting. Okay, and that already brings us to my last course, which is called Écrire avec un accent, so writing with an accent. And in our last course, we talked about how writers deal with their multilingualism in their works. I can't talk anymore. We talked about how writers deal with their multilingualism in their work and the play that can result from incorporating different languages into one book, into one novel, for example. So Beckett, for example, famously both wrote in English and in French, and he translated his own works, but he didn't translate them exactly. You know, you're not getting the same piece of theater in English and in French because he always changed some things. And it's just, I don't know, that's like such a tongue-in-cheek thing to do. I really want to look into that more. Another aspect of playing with several languages is that you can have words that are polysemitic, so meaning that they have different meanings, right? Poly means several, and sem is meaning. So I'm sure you have encountered words that have different meanings in different languages, and then they can be interpreted differently if you use that. So, for example, we looked at Teresa Hakyung-cha, who has written in several languages about the pain, amongst other things, the pain of not being able to, or not being allowed to speak her mother tongue during the Japanese occupation. And she wrote the book that is called Dictée. And Dictée in French is an exercise that you do in school when the teacher is basically dictating. I don't know if dictating? See, it's a weird word, but in a dictée, you're basically writing down what the teacher says, so you practice your spelling and your writing. So you're listening and you're writing it down. But the title dictée in America, they don't know what a dictée is in America, right? Mostly people don't know. And they read it as dictee. They call it dictee, which is like the person that is being dictated. So the dictator dictates the dictee. And that is a perfect double meaning there, because it talks about the power dynamics of language, kind of, and what it means to take the natural language away from someone. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm feeling so much better that I have my desk here. I've actually spent like an hour rearranging furniture before I started filming, because I just feel so much better when I have a desk here. I'm really liking this setup a lot more than anything else I've had so far here. So yeah. Oh, and also thank you so much for 30,000 subscribers. I'm so wow. I mean, wow. I don't even know what to say. It's great. Thank you. It's very, very motivating and so lovely to hear from all of you. And yeah, I'm not sure if I should do any like special video or something. If you have an idea, you can let me know. I'll consider it. And other than that, I'll just see you in my next video. Thank you. Bye bye.